Tim O'Malley with Tim Priester of Irish Illustrated and John Bryce of FootballScoop.com, and we are removed from speaking with Marcus Freeman for 30 minutes, and for the second straight week, Coach Freeman had to talk a lot about the previous week because of how it finished, and maybe the goal going into USC week would be that we don't spend the entire time talking about Louisville on Monday, but that's the nature of the beast when you play two very physical games. They come down to the last 30 seconds, and as Coach Freeman said, this one was the polar opposite of last week. They found a way to win. That's what champions do. And offensively and defensively, I think people forget, Notre Dame found a way to win this game against Duke.
They did, and I asked him about turnovers because rarely does a Mike Elko team get beaten in the turnover department. Notre Dame won that 2-0, and I thought it was interesting. He said, normally we talk about, getting a turnover. He felt that it was necessary they got two turnovers, and in this instance it was true. So, that was an area where Notre Dame won. Other areas where they didn't win that we spent time talking about today was the penalty situation and 12 penalties. But it's 9 pre-snap penalties. Right. And, I talked last week about, I don't think this stadium is going to be a difficult place to play. But it kind of was. It was louder than I remembered it 4 years ago because it's a different Duke with a different regime and everybody's excited. But they struggled with that. Zeke Correll struggled with that. And, it's something that you just – nobody wants to hear the excuses. You're going in a tough environment, but they've been in tough environments before and haven't had those problems. So you have to clean them up in addition to getting ready for, as he said, a Louisville team that does have a lot of skill position athletes that can hurt you.
Another challenge this week, John, is there's a mental challenge, and I don't know how you get over the mental hurdle of 2 straight games like that, trying to recoup every time for Louisville and USC. But I believe there's a physical challenge going into 6 straight Saturdays, 2 very physical ones. I don't know if it's this week or next week. Somewhere along the way, they're going to have to pull back a little bit in their preparation because their legs got to be feeling it.
Yeah, you asked a great question today of Marcus Freeman about managing that workload. And again, we've talked about it. I've written about it. We talked about it all throughout preseason camp. I thought he and his staff have done a masterful job of having the pulse of the team, of knowing when to dial back, of the fact that he literally has altered Thursday practices in this season to scale some things back or maybe to ratchet up intensity in 2 to 3 periods just to see where his team is. So I think Marcus Freeman does a good job of having the pulse of his team, and you're right. They've got to have a break in here at some point, not getting in until 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning Sunday. I do think it's a benefit this week, not from an environment standpoint because we know Louisville will be louder at night. I do think it's a benefit that they get a later kickoff because that Saturday means the guys get to sleep in a little bit down in Louisville. It's a little more leisurely when they have the team breakfast there in the hotel. Then they will have some meetings and then a light walkthrough in the afternoon. So I do think that a night kickoff as opposed to, say, a noon kickoff, that's 12 hours, obviously not really 12 hours, but ultimately it's 12 hours extra that Notre Dame gets to get some more of its legs back under it.
Well, they're used to it by now, too. They'll be used to it for the following week with USC. See, Pittsburgh game is the trap game. They have to play in the afternoon for that game. But we got some injury news from Coach Freeman. The best news is that Eli Raridon is expected to play. He mentioned Jaden Thomas and Jaden Greathouse are both expected to play, but I never felt he would not say that. So we will monitor their progress throughout the week because hamstring injuries and wide receivers don't mix. But it's good news that they could be ready for this game.
Yeah, it's a heck of a lot better than running 3 wide receivers out there. I would imagine that Jaden Thomas is probably the closest of the two or ahead of Jaden Greathouse, but they need them both. I mean, in evaluating, going over the film of the game, Rico Flores fortunately finished with a flourish, but Tobias Merriweather never did take off in this game, targeted 4 times, and he didn't catch a pass. And, I know that there was some complaints about how Jared Parker approached things, and I get that, but when your top 2 wideouts, have 2 receptions on 11 targets, which is what it came down to with Flores and Merriweather, you're a little bit reluctant to try to press that button over and over again.
Right.
So, when Audric Estime carries on back-to-back plays and up the middle and it's 7 yards and 6 yards, like it was frequently in the first 5 games, you don't consider that to be, poor play calling. When you call his number twice and he gains 3 and 2, now you're 3rd and 5 and you have to do something different.
Nolan Ziegler could be back as well. I don't know if that means he would dress and go with the team for the first time on a road game, or if that means he would be available to play, which would be special teams, of course, for Ziegler this week, I'd assume, as he assimilates back in. But this will be the 3rd time Coach Freeman as either coordinator or head coach sees Jack Plummer at quarterback. I thought it was interesting. He said, we're going to try to confuse him. It's just really hard to confuse him. Obviously, that is just part of the plan when you're going against anyone trying to switch the defense up. But interesting that they have Plummer for a third time in 3 years. Of course, 3 different football teams.
Yeah, that's got to be a first. I know we're in a day and age of
it won't
college.
be a last, but
right.
It's probably a first.
I know we're in a day and age of guys like Plummer or JT Daniel, who has been at a number of different places. But I do think that the advantage favors Notre Dame in this situation because the Irish defense with Marcus Freeman very heavily involved, obviously, the first 2 meetings, had really good success against Plummer. And then he went ahead and voluntarily divulged today, something we've talked about on these breakdowns before. They still have more that they're bringing out and showing each and every week from a blitz standpoint. They're still having to do that because they're not getting the natural 4-man pass rush very often. So I like the fact that he's being upfront about trying to affect Plummer, and I do think if you can make him hold on to the ball longer, that favors it because then he does, I think the decision-making breaks down a little bit. It makes it a little more tougher. You maybe get into his head a little bit.
Yeah, I think Jack Plummer confuses himself maybe more than the opposing defense does at times.
We saw one very bad pass
Yes,
last week while we were waiting for dinner, but I didn't want to end this until I get to Tim Priester's question about Howard Cross, because you've been on Howard Cross for 2 years now about how underrated of a player he is, even by Notre Dame fans. That underrated part might have gone away after one of the best games we've seen from a defensive lineman keeping his team in the game. Coach Freeman had an interesting comment when you asked about Cross today, what makes him so good.
Yeah, preparation was a big part of it, and confidence in himself, which I wonder where that comes from. His father, of course, Howard Sr., played in the NFL for a long time, and so that's all part of it. I just find Howard Cross is a really interesting character because when we speak with him, he's just so mild-mannered. He had a sinus infection the other night. He did that the other night with a sinus infection. I just think he's a really interesting guy who's learned from his father and has become a great player. And then the concept, I wrote this today in Tail of the Tape, the concept of him going undrafted because he's undersized, that to me is utterly ridiculous. This guy is producing at this level against that level of competition. I find it really hard to believe. And if somehow that happens, I would imagine that somebody will pick him up and he'll make an NFL team.
We have a week full of coverage coming up for this game, Notre Dame Louisville. Until then, I'm Tim O'Malley. This is Tim Priester, John Bryce from FootballScoop.com, Irish Illustrated Instant Analysis.